It was the late 1990s and I'd been driving trucks for nearly a decade. I'd heard my share of road stories, ghosts, cryptids, killers, but I never believed any of it. That changed one November night on a stretch of highway in eastern Kentucky. I was hauling a load of timber on a desolate route, the kind where you don't see another vehicle for hours. The moon was full, but the fog was thick, rolling over the road like a curtain. I was passing mile marker 237 when my CB radio crackled. "Break 19. You copy?" The voice was raspy, distant. I hesitated. There wasn't another truck in sight. "Yeah, I copy. Who's out there?" "Got trouble ahead," the voice said, dragging out the words like molasses. "Better slow down." I instinctively tapped the brakes. Before I could respond, the radio went dead. I scanned the road, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. A couple of minutes later, I came to a sharp bend, and there it was, a wreck. A rusted pickup truck sat crumpled in the ditch, its front end smashed. I pulled over to check it out. The truck looked ancient, like it hadn't moved in decades, yet its headlights flickered weakly. There was no sign of a driver. I called out, my voice swallowed by the mist. That's when I saw the figure. A man stood just beyond the wreck, tall and thin, wearing a filthy flannel shirt and overalls. His face was pale as the fog, his eyes sunk in pits of darkness. He raised one bony hand and pointed at me. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said in that same raspy voice. I bolted back to my rig, locking the doors. My hands trembled as I fumbled to start the engine. In my mirrors, I saw him walking toward me, his movements unnatural, jerky, like a puppet on strings. The engine roared to life and I tore out of there, but as I passed the wreck, the man stood in the middle of the road watching me. Later, I learned the story. In the 1950s, a trucker swerved to avoid a stalled car at mile marker 237 and died in the crash. They say he warns drivers just like I was warned that night. But here's the thing. No one can explain who or what caused his wreck in the first place. I never took that route again. I was hauling freight through a lonely stretch of I-84 in Idaho. The night was dead quiet, and the only light came from my truck's headlights slicing through the darkness. It was past midnight, and fatigue was setting in when I spotted a figure on the shoulder ahead. He stood still, arm raised, signaling for a ride. I frowned. Who'd be out here miles from anything? As I passed, my lights caught him. A tall man in a long coat, face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Against my instincts, I stopped. He climbed in without a word, his movements stiff. The door thudded shut, and I noticed the floor mat beneath him was damp, though the night had been dry. I started driving, the silence between us thick and uneasy. I asked where he was heading, but he didn't respond. He just stared forward, his hat shadowing his face. The truck grew colder. My breath misted in the air, and I felt the hairs on my arms rise. Glancing at the passenger mirror, my heart stopped. His seat was empty. Panicked, I whipped my head toward him. He was still there, but his face, it wasn't a face. Just darkness, a bottomless void where his features should have been. I slammed the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt and I threw the door open, scrambling into the night. When I turned back, the passenger door was locked. Later I told my story at a truck stop. An old-timer shook his head. "You met the Phantom Rider," he said. "He's a warning. Some don't listen, and they never make it home. I never pick up hitchhikers anymore." Mike, a long-haul trucker, was used to lonely nights, but something about this stretch of road felt wrong. It was a foggy, moonless night, and the highway ahead seemed to vanish into darkness. His radio crackled with static, and his only company was the rumble of the truck's engine. Around 2 a.m., he spotted someone standing on the shoulder ahead, a woman in a tattered dress, waving desperately. Against his better judgment, he stopped and rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" he asked hesitantly. The woman silently climbed into the cab, her face pale, her eyes sunken. She mumbled something incoherent and stared straight ahead. Mike felt uneasy but kept driving, hoping to reach a rest stop soon. A few miles later, he glanced over and she was gone. Panicked, he stopped the truck, searching the cab and the road behind him. There was no trace of her. Shaking it off as exhaustion, Mike continued. Minutes later, his rearview mirror caught movement in the sleeper behind him. He froze. Turning slowly, he saw her sitting there, her head tilted unnaturally, her dark eyes locked on him. Terrified, Mike swerved to the side of the road and leapt from the cab, leaving the truck idling. When he dared to look back, the woman was now outside, standing on the highway, her face contorted in an inhuman grin. Mike ran until he reached a gas station miles ahead. He reported the incident, only to hear the clerk's chilling response. "You saw her, didn't you? Drivers call her the endless passenger. She only shows herself to those she plans to follow." Mike quit trucking the next day. But every night since, he hears knocking on his bedroom window.